There was no money to buy buildings. So how are you going to restore buildings if you can't buy them?
And you just feel, okay, I really can't do this anymore. I don't see any point in it anymore.
And lots of people are always happy with the status quo.
They were waiting for the other shoe to drop. They were waiting for a disaster.
It just seemed, too important to walk away from.
There were enough people to want things to grow.
And I couldn't walk away.
We need more development within the town.
It was their livelihood they were fighting for as well.
We felt that we were important.
I could certainly see just exactly what this town could become.
For almost half a century, shipbuilding is a major force in the economy of this region.
Every creek and cove had a schooner or a square rigger being built in it.
There were 75 men working just in the Delap shipyards. It'd be hard-pressed to name a business in this area today that employs 75 people.
All of those families that lived out in those communities, Maitland, Caledonia, Milford, all of them cut lumber. Some of them had mills, but many of them brought their lumber to Annapolis to be shipped overseas.
You find Annapolis as the magnet, the center for this whole region. This is the shopping area.
In terms of business in St. George Street, there are a number of merchants who sold wares in the town.
Families came in once a month, twice a month to do their shopping, to spend their money, and to sell their goods.
People were laborers. They fished, they farmed, they sailed. Some of the same trades that are represented here in the last 30, 40, 50 years.
Although in the late 19th century, Annapolis Royal and a great many other smaller communities in the Maritimes had been able to quite successfully navigate the economic changes that were taking place in North America. That was starting to change. The small industries in the Maritimes, in many of these smaller communities, just could not operate at large enough capacity, large enough size to successfully compete. I don't think people were as bored as we might think, or certainly as our children and grandchildren might think they would be with nothing to do. I don't think that was ever really a problem.
Parades were a highlight of the year for Annapolis.
Parades have an important economic aspect. If you can draw a few extra 100 people of a Saturday afternoon, this is good business. It's going to put money in your till. By the 1970s, the economic malaise is reflected by unoccupied storefronts. It means less employment. It means less reason to visit Annapolis, less reason to move to Annapolis. It was clear that Annapolis needed new directions and new vision.
So the war made it clear that life was not going to be the same here. It's going to be very, very different. And because the day of sailing ships was over and so on, you weren't going to see a lot of traffic coming through this town, commercial-wise, I mean. So it became clear by the late 50s and 60s that if it continued, the town literally was going to lose a lot of its structures and a lot of its identity, a lot of its heart.
Those of us who worked and lived in the area were aware that the town was in, pretty fragile condition, that its future looked pretty dim.
When I think of tourists coming to the area, they came on buses and left in buses that same afternoon. They would do the wharf and they would do the habitation and then go on.
There's no art gallery in town. There's no craft shop in town. There's nothing of that sort. There's no antique store in town.
People at that time were just trying to make a living and weren't really interested with anything happening.
Well, there were 2 hardware stores, 2 drug stores, really not much else.
The place to shop was really Bridgetown at the time.
A lot of businesses were closing and were having difficulty.
Business was not great. We were fortunate that Cornwallis was still a working base. One of the pieces of our business was irons and ironing boards for all the recruits. And the Home Hardware main office wanted to know why the people of Annapolis Royal did so much ironing.
You could fire a cannon down St. George Street Saturday morning and not risk hitting anybody.
I remember being puzzled because the town, I think, closed on Wednesday afternoons and Saturdays, right? So you're like, okay. So it was a whole different sort of a culture.
The upper town wasn't shabby.
There were some beautiful homes and some very well-maintained homes.
The good side of that was that those old houses, there was no money to pour into them. So they were intact from what they'd been 2 generations before.
It was more the business district.
We had to do something because within the town itself, it wasn't growing.
Some people did not want Annapolis to change, but maybe we have to have those people to make the other people want to do it.
Our biggest problem was we needed people in the town to generate business, commerce.
In the late 70s, the then mayor of Annapolis said, we need a bigger tax base. Obviously, the solution to this would be to bulldoze Fort Anne. How many acres there that you could turn into a subdivision, where those people were going to come from to build those new houses, why anyone would move to Annapolis at that point is, you could have that debate.
There was a very strong heritage community within the town, always has been. Lots of those were little old ladies like Charlotte Perkins or that grew up here and just had a passion for the place.
Almost a precursor to the Development Commission was Ralph and Marguerite Wagner buying what we now know as the Odell Inn.
She was the one who greatly pushed that idea of restoring buildings in Annapolis Royal.
The fact that these people wanted to save the buildings on Lower St. George Street was just caused certainly everybody to wonder.
The question became, if you save old buildings, why? More importantly, if you got rid of old buildings, what then? And there wasn't any what then. It was pointing out the economic benefits of preserving old buildings.
A lot of people at the time thought there wasn't enough for young people, and they wanted a rink because the rink had burned some years earlier. And they thought, fixing up old property was not going to help anybody.
Not everybody in town thought it was smart to move in this direction. You want to forget the past. That's the problem. Annapolis has too much of the past. It's too mired in its history.
There's a lot of people that were committed to make something happen, including my parents as part of it.
I certainly credit Jim Howe to a large extent. He realized that, okay, we've got to make this seen not as an imposition, not as a threat to your ownership of your building, but as an honor.
It kind of went from dying slowly with an understanding that we can't do anything about it or we don't want to change, or to a realization that we needed new blood. And frankly, I just want to point out here that a lot of the new blood came from the cultural community. They had a lot of good ideas. Later on, we made sure we listened to them because it was a whole new type of growth for a small rural town.
I think a lot of it was, how the hell are we going to do this?
And you had to be positive. That was the biggest thing with the, I found at that time, you had no negativity. You always had to be positive.
I don't recall ever thinking that it was a lost cause. Maybe I'm innately optimistic, but I just said, this has got to be good.
The overall plan for the Development Commission, that was the planning, came from the people.
Early stages of the projects going to move forward, it became clear that the government was not going to actually do them. The government would be there hand in hand, but it had to be a local driven and controlled thing.
John Johnson was a person who really wanted to see things improve.
Mr. Johnson was, well, he was a school teacher and a principal, but he was the chairman of the Development Commission.
We would meet, and Agnes McCormick and sometimes John Aiken and some others, but those two or three in particular, came to the point where if we're going to have funding, the town's got to take responsibility for the end product. In other words, if it's done, they then have to own it. And John Johnson totally agreed with that, realizing we needed a lot of help down here. We had to provide additional funding to operate it. There were expenses, and that included hiring a very good head honcho, if you like, and that's in the person of Paul Buxton.
If they hadn't hired him, I don't think there would be, Annapolis Royal would be a town today.
I looked at the town with very different eyes and saw it a little differently. And I could see many things that popped out at me. And when I read the feasibility study, I thought this is probably the best sort of feasibility study that I've read, because it was practical, it dealt with real things. Something could happen here.
There were some properties that need to be acquired because they were getting to be for sale. Once the Development Commission was formed properly, then we could borrow money.
They didn't put a development commission together that consisted of just interested people, people who liked history. The town's major merchants were on that commission.
Peter Nicholson, Sr., and Greg Kerr, those people came through.
And that was very important to the success of the Development Commission by Greg Kerr and Peter Nicholson, too, both of them sending that kind of signal that, hey, for the sake of Annapolis, we can work together.
It took us time, but we had to be patient.
Probably when I was in junior high that the discussions were started, and then when I was in senior high that really plans came together and building and construction started on some of these projects.
The good thing was there were so many public meetings, so you knew what was going on. People were engaged and informed.
I don't know if we knew what we hoped it would be exactly, because at that point you're building things, and the people part of it had yet to unwind as to how that was going to affect the town.
And then Paul Buxton became the executive director, and he was really outstanding.
That was the biggest asset that we had, was Paul.
All of this wouldn't have happened without someone with the tenacity of Paul doing what he did.
Paul is a force to be reckoned with. Quite a remarkable person, and certainly was the ideal person for the Development Commission. He's got his soft and his hard side, and he was able to roll up his shirt sleeves and fight it out with the financing people, work with the community groups. A fellow doesn't take no for an answer and certainly knows how to get something done.
We never thought of it as working for Paul. We worked for what he believed in.
Using local people was very important.
I employed local people. I was slightest bit interested in bringing anybody in to do the job.
But we had great tradesmen within our area here.
That kind of locally based process really worked in the past. Why wouldn't it work now?
And I knew Paul Buxton. He knew I was a plumber, and he asked me if I'd look at a little job for them up there. So I went up to look at it and stayed for 10 years.
Donnie Bougie, what a wonder.
He ended up being in charge of several of the projects.
I worked on the farmer's market, the boat hall, up the Adams Ritchie, Historic Gardens, the Mews.
Donnie is the sort of person you would see at 8 o'clock in the morning down in a mud hole digging and doing plumbing work, and 5 hours later you have a suit on and be selling tickets.
We could have had an electrician putting down sod. That's how everybody was. It wasn't, nobody would say, well, that's not my job, I'm not doing that. Everybody just pitched in, and I think that's how come things ran as smooth as they did, was for the fact that everybody did pitch in.
And you know, going back to the Development Commission under Paul's guidance, I think at one point they had 115 people on the payroll.
I'm the kind of person, when I'm asked to do a job, I will get that job done and recruit the people who can help me do the job. And if anybody's in my way, it's not my job to persuade them that this is the right thing to do. I simply go ahead and do the job. And I'm sure I was not the most popular person in the town of Annapolis Royal. And there were real hurdles even after the money had been granted.
Even though most of it was from other parts of the government, it still was a lot of money being spent. On the other hand, it created a whole ton of employment.
Joan Hamilton joined me as a bookkeeper, sort of just a general helper around the office.
I could put a budget together in my sleep after a while.
At any one time, we were running 8 to 10 different sets of books, and then they all had to be amalgamated into our annual accounting.
To make sure they were done right, I didn't worry about it because I knew they was.
The books were balanced to a penny. That's a huge job, and it was incredibly important to maintain our credibility.
You get those people, usually men, in from the government that wanted to know all the stuff about what was going on.
We had jobs on the shelf. So when the feds called and said, project's gone down somewhere else, you can have 10 people for 12 weeks and $3,000 materials. Have you got anything? I said, we'll start Monday morning. The town rather thought that the $2.25 million had come to the town in cash, and it resided in my right-hand top desk drawer. And it was only a question really of persuading me to do something, and I could reach in and, handle a bundle of cash over.
But there were non-believers. Gardens was one of the things people were like, that's never going to work. There's no way. How can we have a botanical garden here? We're 2 hours from the city and it just isn't going to work.
This is crazy. You're wasting our time and our money, and why are you doing this? And we should be doing something else.
The local press was just waiting for that headline.
Then the next thing they'd be saying is it should have been done better, or why isn't it something else?
Some of that began to change with projects that dramatically altered the appearance of the town.
As people saw these things actually coming online, this is actually possible here, then you start to get some real enthusiasm from the residents and from the people who then get behind it.
That's part of the wisdom and the cooperation between the John Johnsons and the volunteers and the government people that were encouraging, stay the course, stay the course, stay the course. Realizing that if it's a well thought out project, well founded, whatever you've done, years later will still be there.
Old Muse Hotel, as it was then known, was, for all intents and purposes and all appearances, a not terribly attractive 3-story, dilapidated former inn.
It was almost on the point of collapse. You know, what do we do with it?
Its future was pretty dicey at this point. A strong feeling that, okay, it really would make a great parking lot.
The first thing that I needed to do was to get inside, break into the walls and put some cross bracing up, because I was really quite afraid it would come down like an accordion.
And then really said, okay, well, what can we do with it? And kind of unleashed the technical people, myself, Barry, et cetera, to look at the building. It was a 3-story Victorian alteration, I think, done by A.M. King, and it came right out to the street.
As we break into the walls, we see mud construction, mud insulation. Barry Moody was very much a part of our crew at that time, Dr. Moody, and he came in and he said, that's Acadian. This is an Acadian period building.
Because much of the building had been gutted, you could see that for part of it at least, there was wattle and daub, clay infill in the wall.
And Barry, I remember him coming up to the office at some point and said, wow, I found another building.
We've got a building that was expanded to make that 3-story Victorian, but it didn't start out that way.
So under Barry's guidance, they start peeling the building away.
We decided we'd take off all the back of the building, take off the 3rd floor, and restore it to its 1783 period. When the Loyalists came, a 2nd floor went on.
We didn't have the advantage of things like dendrochronology. We couldn't determine the age of the building, or the old part of the building.
We start looking at historic elements, records.
We had one photograph, pre-Victorian, plus the physical remains that are there. The Victorian parts and the newer additions were in much worse shape than parts that were, 150 years earlier.
Paul had to keep the crews working. So the only way to keep the crews working was to encapsulate the building. So they built scaffolding around it, tarped it, so that the crews could continue to work, get our modicum of heat in the building.
I was there in that building 5 days a week from, I would say, September of '80 through almost till opening day.
The windows were built locally by Fred Vidito out in Lakeele. The millwork, the doors, etc., all based on what Barry was able to find, including, he found one of the original windows buried in a wall somewhere or other, so we could replicate all the details. So all this happened within this opaque tarpaulin.
Paul came up fairly early on with the, I thought, brilliant idea that we'd leave the front part on, the Victorian part on, and work behind that so that nobody could see what was taking place. Culmination of all of that led to one of the most exciting days for the Development Commission, and certainly one of the more exciting days for me. They closed the street for a while. They had the school band there to play after a few of the speeches, to have that moment when the tarp was dropped off the front of the building and you saw for the first time this rather beautiful Georgian building. That, I think, not only was very dramatic for those of us who had worked on it, but it also silenced a number of the doubters in town. I mean, here was pretty dramatic proof that things were changing.
In my mind, I was probably looking at it as construction of things and fixing up of buildings and painting of facades. The boardwalk coming together was kind of cool because that was a neat new use for the waterfront.
The waterfront walkway wasn't blessed with open arms at the time.
I think the first thing that Paul and I did together for that was got the design started. A lot of civil engineering, et cetera, involved.
People can understand why trucks are dumping rocks in the river. I know some of the same people that were fairly negative at the time loved the waterfront walkway.
The King's Theatre did not fit any of the criteria. It was not an historic building in the usual definition. It was an appalling looking building. It was full of rats.
We even had rats running around at the time we were down there.
I always sit with my feet up in the next, because it always had a feeling that there was something running around.
Very stained, grotty seats, and a full complement of rats.
You would buy 2 popcorns, one for yourself and one for the rats.
I was there the night the big rip got in the screen. Somebody threw a beer bottle at the screen, and there was a rip in it about that long that was there for the next 20 years.
It was right down there next to the wharf, right in sort of the prime place. So we had to do something with that building. So first of all, we have to buy it. It had 4 mortgages and 29 lien holders, and we have no money.
Paul then said, well, if we're going to have a theater, we've got to have somebody to define what the theater should be.
And when Paul invited the Annapolis District Drama Group to form a committee, that was a really smart move. We were drawn to that kind of a project.
So the program kind of evolved as we worked on the building, and problems we found with the building were sort of bounced off the theater group, and the theater group bounced ideas off of us.
So to invite drama group people to be part of the rejuvenation of the local theater was genius.
We owned the DAR property, which was the triangle of railway track where the parking lot and the farmer's market is now, and I had sold off the south end of that to the home hardware store, and with the money from that, I bought the King's Theatre.
We wanted to see the theater open its doors again, but in a slightly different format. First of all, we wanted it to be a showplace, which it did turn out to be. We had the right architects and carpenters and decorators involved. We wanted it to be a place where you could go and find something for everyone.
So what to do with it? Well, we could do the outside. Facades were in because they were politically acceptable. You could see something was being done. All the time I know what I'm going to do with the building. Always better to ask for forgiveness afterwards.
After board meetings were finished, a few of us would drive home together, and then we would sit in a driveway in the car, and we'd talk and talk and talk for another hour or 2 because we were so excited about what was happening.
The commission formed a committee to do something with the building and sort of internally let it be known that it was to be, we were going to reopen the theatre. We managed to restore the exterior, the interior, the stage area, which was on the point of collapse. We put a big steel frame in the back of the building, but all on the pretense of saving the building. And we had some influence, fortunately, at the provincial level, and we got a significant grant from them. And we bought seats, we bought a screen, we bought projectors, and we had a big opening day.
When we opened the theater for the very first time, we invited all of those stakeholders who had put money and time into our project. We wanted them to see what we had been busy doing.
The federal official was there, and he didn't know. We had the thing out, we had the ceremony outside of the building, and we had everybody there. We made an event of these things, a ribbon cutting, and he cut the ribbon on behalf of the federal government. And we went into the lobby and then into the theatre, turned the theatre lights up, and he said, you bastard. And I said, but isn't it wonderful? And he said, yes, it is. And it was done. And that night we had a classical guitarist in, had our first performance, the theatre, to a full house. We had money assigned in that feasibility study to build the gardens, but we have no land, we have no buildings, we have no anything.
I would assume if you're new to town and you look at the gardens sort of came bang, somebody built the gardens without really understanding the changes, the sacrifices, the collegiality, the pushback to create the gardens.
In order to make the gardens concept, the gardens idea viable, the Development Commission had to rely on the willingness to take some risk on the part of the property owners that were integral to the integrity of what would become the gardens.
We wanted the Kerr house because we really needed the whole of the back garden there, and we needed some more parking at the front.
The two buildings, our family home and the home next to it, became an integral part of the gardens itself. And I remember Dad saying, well, Shirley, it's time we moved out of this big house.
They agreed on a price.
Under the market value, because that was a criticism that Jack was making lots of money off this thing.
The management committee really thought that they had put the final stop to it by saying, so how are you going to maintain them? Unless you can guarantee that you can maintain these gardens, no, we're not going to give you the money to build them.
And I think there was a fair amount of pushback in the community about the gardens as an entity, talking about whether it would be a success. There were a lot of people that said, this is just a waste of money.
You could say, well, we projected that we'll get so many visitors at X dollars a head, and that will enable us to pay this and that and so on. So here's a little analysis. And they say, well, that's all speculation, isn't it? Well, of course it's all speculation. But so many things are done in this world on pure speculation. And again, we were very fortunate. We had an angel in passing who worked for the provincial government, and I won't even give you his department, who wrote us a letter saying that his department had undertaken to guarantee the maintenance. I waved it to the management committee and I said, there's your answer. The provincial government's just guaranteed it. That man was essentially responsible for the gardens being there. We had the backhoes out there the next morning.
Pat Pelham and his design sense at the beginning and in those early years, I think was really important.
I think the design of that gardens is just incredible. Just the way the paths lead you from one area to the next. You know, somebody had that vision and that foresight and they could see what was going to happen there.
Often in the evenings, I would sort of walk out into the courtyard and there he was just standing by a rock with a pipe in his hand, just musing.
I realized as I was going along that the skills that I had were skills that nobody else had. You know, like I taught the crew, you know, I taught them how to garden, I taught them the fine points of raking and, you know, all that stuff.
His attention to detail and being really meticulous about maintenance and how things should be really has served the gardens well. We were doing a path in the rose garden, just putting the gravel out and raking it smooth, right? And we're like, yeah, that looks really good, right? And Pat's like, no. Can't you see? He goes, it's doing this, right? And I remember Dorothy is just rolling her eyes going, well, that's just crazy, you know, I don't see that. And it was, you could see it. I remember that instance when it all of a sudden dawned on her. She was like, oh yeah.
Historic gardens are essentially a series of historic theme gardens which reflect periods of Nova Scotia's horticultural history. Being a Nova Scotian, right, and having been here for, you know, hundreds of years, my ancestors on pretty well all sides. I definitely felt the responsibility to do it properly and have something at the end of the process that was worthwhile having. Plus the fact that I, you know, was interested and trained as an ornamentalist, and I really wanted to put some of these plants in there and hunt down plants of interest and get them in there. In the spring of 1981, we had graded all the hills and we ordered all the seed because we couldn't afford sod, and all these big areas that were huge areas we had to seed down. Paul was standing beside me and we looked over the hills and the sun was up and you could just see a sheen of green coming through above the brown, just tiny little green fuzz, right? Which meant that the grass was viable, right? That's a big deal, right? I mean, otherwise you're going to have a sea of dirt, right? It's not going to be very attractive.
And it was all done in a very short period of time.
2 weeks before the gardens opened, they realized they didn't have sod in a lot of places. And so Nell Crow and many other people donated their lawns.
Yeah, I thought it was great sign of support. We had Harold McCormick, who had a nursery, right? A Wishing Rock Nursery up at the head of the hill. He donated umpteen amount, like incredible amounts of plant material.
We were working double shifts, so my crew in the afternoon got to be made up of the electricians and plumbers, and so they were put on horticultural duty. They were very good. They were very gracious. They were very cooperative.
We had a good board led by Jeff McCormick at the time as our chairman, and Jeff was in it always. Not that he was an expert on running a restaurant or anything else, but we had lots of meetings, we talked lots. You know, he was another mentor in a whole bunch of ways.
The debate seemed to be, isn't it wonderful? We have a gardens. I said, no, the country. has a gardens. This is an economic tool. That's how it was developed. Not being critical, just pointing out, it's not about the fact that the local garden club has its own gardens. It's about bringing people from everywhere.
You can restore a house, but not everybody's a historian. But I've never met anybody that doesn't like a beautiful garden.
I think my favorite project and the one that gave me the most satisfaction is the Sinclair Inn. It's right next door to my office, so I look at it every day. The building was privately owned and in terrible condition, really on the verge of collapsing. It was late in the projects that the Development Commission was involved in. Here we have just a remarkable piece of construction, both by age and all the various technicalities it represents. Eventually, the community was able to purchase the building.
All the buildings that we did, we had to have a purpose. And not only that, but they had to start to generate money immediately.
Because we could not get any financing for conservation, rehabilitation, restoration of the project. The building originally, or not originally because it was built in sequence, went right back to St. James Street. So somehow or other we came up with this idea that we could recreate something that was similar to one of the carriage houses at the back of the building. So we built that new, renovated the link that goes back to the Sinclair Inn itself, and that was used as a revenue generator and an economic element, something paying for itself to justify the funds to work on the Sinclair Inn. It really was Barry's view to say we should not remove anything, we should not cover anything, we should tell this story as it is, where people can see the bones, the flaws, the changes, the additions. It was kind of like Christmas in a way, because we kept unraveling things or opening things up, finding that it was not a building, but parts of buildings that had been moved, reconfigured, altered. Barry understood that the pieces of the true cross were that. You couldn't give away any of the original pieces. There was no point in replicating it. It was the fact that this is the real thing. He literally wouldn't allow us to take out rotted timbers or anything. So we would try to come up with ways to secure the building without removing any of the even deteriorated artifacts. We're unfortunately not appreciative of it. I mean, here we have one of the oldest standing frame buildings in Canada. We kind of treat it like the next door neighbor or, whatever, but we're not appreciative of it, but it's still there because of the wisdom of people like Barry and Paul.
At all the Board of Trade meetings, and I was president of the Board of Trade at the time, we would discuss, wouldn't it be nice to have a farmer's market? But nobody did anything, so I said, let's have a farmer's market. And they said, sure, go ahead. So we did. That's how it happened. I don't think we even asked permission to use the property.
That particular place down there was basically a railroad track, no development.
And that market was something that people could not visualize.
The town built us the sawhorses and we bought the plywood.
The farmer's market, I can remember when we poured that. I was down there at 3 o'clock in the morning making sure we didn't have any cats or dogs going across it.
For a few dollars, you had a table, and we pooled the resources and bought another piece of plywood every week. Got to be a happy gathering place.
You know that old saying, if you build it, they will come. And they did.
The haul-up came about at a judicious time. The scallop industry locally has peaks and valleys. And at the time that the Development Commission was riding high, the scallop industry was as well.
When we agreed that that was a good project, because we saw the future of the wharf, which wasn't quite there then, and tied in with the theater as a cultural thing, having the fishing community actually doing maintenance work in Annapolis was a no-brainer. Turns out it was a no-brainer to about 2 of us.
Billy Wombold was a painting contractor here in town who had initially worked with houses but had gotten into painting boats and was working at the wharf at low tide. You know, they'd chase the tide out and paint the bottom, and the tide would chase them in, and then they'd do the top side. So it was limiting.
Fishermen didn't want to come to Annapolis. The town didn't want them there. So we had to say, I know the town sees fishermen differently. If you go to a wharf, it's messy, it's this, that, whatever. Fishermen haven't felt welcome in the town. And the only time I remember being a pain in the butt saying, you know, this is all provincial money. We know it fits in with what the town's trying to do, and we know it's important for the fishing community.
In its wisdom, the Development Commission hired locals to execute the project. In fact, most of the crew that worked on the haul-up were all young local fellows, a number of whom ended up working at the haul-up afterwards.
So once it got in there and was done, I was really, really pleased that the parties came together after fashion and the wharf finally came about and so on. And the end result being that it's been a great relationship. I've had relatives show up in the summer and can't imagine not going through the market and going through out in the wharf and looking at the boats and the haul-up.
A lot of particularly marine projects that are encouraged to enhance tourism are contrived. The beauty of the haul-up is we repair modern boats that serve a modern fishing industry. We use traditional and modern techniques. It has proved a godsend for the fishermen in the area. It's real.
It always pays to bring in a new perspective. So it was time for me to go.
The Development Commission operated everything up until 1986. That's when discussions started about would it be better to have each entity be self-operated. There was a lot of angst at the time. You're winding down a Development Commission that has existed for a bunch of years, so there's fear about jobs and all kinds of things that go along with that.
When all was said and done, the town felt extremely hard done by because we had a deficit of about $80,000. And they sort of said, well, how are we ever going to pay this off? So I said, well, you own buildings, just sell them. You know, sell the Adams Ritchie house. And they said, well, nobody would buy that. I said, you go get your assessed value and I'll pay whatever it's assessed at. They came back, gave me a figure, and I said, you'll have a check in the morning. Sold. And your deficit is wiped out.
For a community like Annapolis, you're either going forward or you're going backward. I don't know that there's any possibility really of just standing still.
To start on something that was beat and run down and then to see what it was like when it was finished, it was just amazing.
Built from scratch, I always said. Annapolis Royal today was built from scratch.
Harry and I became friends. We've worked on any number of projects in the years since. We still get together fairly frequently for coffee and chat over both past projects and potential future projects.
The other great legacy of the Development Commission is that awareness of built heritage and its importance.
The people that actually built the projects, in some cases, still run the projects. My first hire was Karen Achenbach. She has maintained the gardens for all these years and still is the head gardener. And Trish Fry was hired in '84 to manage the gardens. She is still the manager of the garden. So you have this continuity. And the most important thing is that it's being kept up. I mean, that is the real lesson here.
It's 40 years now since most of those projects were completed, or at least well underway. And yet they're still functioning.
Financial woes have been part of our life since forever, and still are. I mean, no matter what Development Commission project you are referring to, none of them are slam dunks. Everybody's trying to fundraise to keep the doors open. That's just life right now.
In a town this size, to have a facility such as the King's Theatre is pretty remarkable. You know, the gardens, all of those kinds of projects have kept going by volunteer organizations.
Any community should continue to dream and think about new projects or new ways of working with old projects.
Projects don't necessarily have to be brick and mortar. There are lots of other aspects of community development, of expansion. It's not just buildings or brass plaques. And there are new opportunities there for a development commission that wouldn't look like the development commission of the late 70s, early 80s, but could be just as exciting and just as important for the future.
Nova Scotia, I've often said, is full of beautiful, picturesque little towns, full of them. What sets Annapolis apart is the story.